I've been playing outdoors since I was a kid, standing by the front door at around 2 years old, hollering, "Side, side," trying to get my mom to let me go play outside. Now, after 30 plus years working in the outdoor business, I'm dropping insider conversations every week with brand leaders, guides, marketers, CEOs, and others that make the outdoor business a trillion-dollar juggernaut that drives product innovation, revenue, and public policy for everything outdoors. I'm Rick Sayes. Welcome to the Outdoor Biz Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts.
If you like chocolate, which honestly might be a red flag if you don't, you have to try out Ritual Chocolate. Ritual Chocolate is my favorite chocolate brand by far, and I learned about them from spending a lot of time in Park City, Utah, where they're based nearby, and actually got to take my family to a chocolate tasting at their factory. And it changed the way we all think about and eat small batch chocolate. While I already had loved the bars, it opened up my world to the variety and depth of flavor profiles chocolate can have. I'm so excited to be sharing this with you all. Who Runs This Park listeners get 10% off their online purchases of Ritual Chocolate. Go to ritualchocolate.com, that's RITUAL chocolate.com, and use promo code WRTP for 10% off. You'll be thanking me later for this, I promise. And did I mention I'm obsessed with their packaging? It's so beautiful, so even just having the bars and opening them up is a treat. Get on it and order some chocolate. Okay, let's get back to the show. Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Today we have Jeff Bradybaugh with us, Zion National Park Superintendent. Zion is located in southwest Utah, known for its steep red cliffs, forest trails, and Emerald River. It is world-renowned for its wading hike and famous hikes like Angel's Landing. Jeff himself has been superintendent at Zion for the past 10 years, with extensive experience across the country, ranging from Bryce Canyon superintendent to various positions across Sequoia and Kings Canyon and Mammoth Cave, to name a few. As an avid lover of all things outdoors, Jeff's heart and love for Zion National Park is evident, and it's the highest honor to hear his story today. Jeff, welcome to Who Runs This Park.
Good morning, Maddie.
Good morning. A way I love to start off the interview is just by getting a sense of some of the unique situations folks deal with at their specific parks. So do you have a story from one of the craziest situation you've dealt with as Zion superintendent?
Well, I don't know if it's crazy. I mean, Zion's a busy park. Everything we do here we strive to serve the public here and give them an authentic and experience that understand how they fit and the importance of national parks generally. We have many situations that occur, as you can imagine, between 4.5 to 4.7 million visitors here in the last few years. Again, we strive to give those folks that great experience. We have a number of reviews and those kinds of things that happen throughout the year. We have some interesting wildlife encounters at times, and those can be challenging for the visitors, but also for the park. Most everyone has a great experience when you consider how many folks are coming here.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, you're in a wild place, and I think people can forget that, especially when they're in the busier parts of the national parks. You know, those like wildlife encounters or search and rescues are unfortunately bound to happen.
Yeah, and we have a park that's kind of area where most of the visitors at some point in their visit are there in Zion Canyon, but about the park is entry, and those of course are very different experiences and range from backpacking to canyoneering and different adventures like that. And so people get to see a different side of Zion when they get into the backcountry, for sure.
I mentioned this in the intro, but I think Zion is world known for both the Narrows and Angel's Landing, and both those I would imagine are quite crowded typically. But so you mentioned some of the backcountry and how 90% of the park is actually backcountry. What types of experiences or other hikes are there that maybe don't get as much attention as the Narrows and Angel's Landing?
Yeah, so we have high plateaus that these canyons cut into, and those high plateau areas can range up to even 8,000 feet elevation. So you can get into, ponderosa pine forests and other wooded environments like that you wouldn't expect when you first come to Zion and you
Right.
enter the park at low elevation, which is high desert environment. So those differences, we have 5 different life zones from low elevation to high elevation encompassed in the park. And some of those trails that folks start off on from low elevation actually go into those higher elevations. And then
Wow.
there are some other trails that come in from the boundaries of the park at higher elevations, and you can descend to the lower elevations. So, again, there are different experiences for what different folks are looking for. There is some backcountry camping in some very beautiful environments at higher elevations. The Narrows, many people experience the Narrows from the bottom up, usually hiking up a few miles from the end of the Riverside Walk, which is served by one of the shuttle stops in Zion Canyon. But you can also do the top-down trip, which is about a 16-mile descent
Whoa.
in the Virgin River through the Narrows, coming out at Riverside Walk. That's a permitted hike. We only allow so many folks in there. Many people do it as an overnight. There are some designated campsites in the Narrows. Some folks do it in a single day. It's quite a slog.
Oh my gosh.
And you're in the water most of the time.
I got to do Half Dome a couple years ago at Yosemite. And I think similarly, a lot of people do it in one day, but we were able to get a backcountry permit for the campground at Little Yosemite Valley, I think. So we could hike up. It is possible to do it in one day, but it just made it a lot easier and nicer and more relaxed to do it split up, because we hiked up and then camped, and then we're able to wake up really early and be at the top of Half Dome before a ton of the crowds had made it up. So it's cool that people can kind of choose for the top-down approach for the Narrows, of if they're doing an overnight or if they're, like you said, doing it all in one day, which waiting in the water for 16 miles sounds insane.
Well, it's, as I said, it's a slog, and by the time you're done, you're pretty well exhausted. I prefer to do it personally as an overnight trip. It's a little bit more enjoyable that way, and camping in kind of a unique environment. It's an interesting place to camp overnight, especially the night skies. You kind of see through a little slot, which is basically the top of the canyon rims on either side, and so it's quite an experience, really.
Yeah, what is the campsite like? I've seen pictures of the Narrows. I haven't been yet, but my understanding is it's a river kind of through the canyon and you're walking through it. So are the campsites, like, obviously areas where there's not water, but still within the canyon?
Yeah. They're little areas that are maybe a little bit higher than the river level,
Right.
Where the canyon opens up a little bit, and there's a little more of a river bank, and I wouldn't call it a sandbar, but kind of a stable area along the river there. So there's several of those sites, and as folks get permits for those, they can do it as a single day, or they can get a permit to do a 2-day and camp at one of those campsites.
You're making me think of, and it sounds like you've gotten to do that experience both in a day and taking a backpacking trip. What have been some of your favorite experiences recreating in Zion?
Well, certainly a hike through the Narrows is a highlight. That's, just a really amazing environment. But camping in some of the higher elevation backcountry campsites, again, overnight, we have incredible night skies here in the area. And, it's just so enjoyable to have that experience in a very quiet environment as well. So not only do you have the night sky, but you have very quiet environment. And the hikes, again, can go through several different life zones or in plant communities, and just you see different wildlife. And in those different plant communities and life zones. And it's a dry environment, and you need to consider how much water you're going to pack and prepare for those types of
Oh, right.
things. But summer hike at high elevations while it's dry. It's also fairly warm, so you don't have to pack a whole lot of clothing either. But kind of
True.
trade-off weight is water for clothing, or vice versa.
Yeah. And water's not something you want to skimp on, you know? It's
Not in
pretty
our
important.
environment, that's for sure. We're
No.
constantly reminding visitors about the importance to stay hydrated. And,
Right.
sometimes folks don't realize that even during cooler parts of the year here, they're still in a desert environment and they still need to hydrate. I think sometimes folks don't think about that when they're here in the fall or winter, but it is dry. If you're hiking or otherwise getting a lot of exercise, you want to make sure we get that water.
Yeah, and I'm just spending a little bit of time on Zion, and then I do want to hear, we'll do a bit of a backstory and then come back to Zion, but it's just on the top of my mind because I actually read that, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the challenges with high visitation, especially in the summer months, but I've actually read that there's high visitation in the winter. And I'm curious what type of ways people recreate in the winter season in Zion.
Yeah, the visitation in winter has been growing, and actually quite dramatically over the last few years.
Interesting.
Weather-wise, I mean, we get certainly snow and that sort of thing, particularly at the higher elevations, but even at lower elevations, occasionally during the winter. But most of the winter at lower elevations, I mean, we have temperatures in the 40s and 50s, and even occasionally in the 60s. So
Wow.
it's a nice time to visit. But also, what can make it challenging is some of those areas, particularly at higher elevation, are not accessible very easily because of snow. I mean, we can get 7,000 feet. We're going to get a lot of snow. And so it's not all that easily accessible. If you're prepared for it, of course, no problem. But a lot of folks don't realize, again, that they're moving from a low elevation desert potentially to a higher elevation, forested area, which is going to be a lot different in terms of weather and snow and all those kinds of things. And because most of the park is backcountry, those front country areas can get pretty crowded in the wintertime. And even in those areas, we have, again, being in a narrow canyon, we get freeze-thaw cycle many, many days in the winter, which means that we'll get snow that may be melting and running on over canyon walls, and then at night it freezes. And what happens is we build up these huge icicles. I hesitate to call them icicles. I mean, they're just huge masses of ice, and they can, as they melt and weaken, they can fall. And so oftentimes we do have to close some of the trails, even in the front country areas, because we're experiencing these massive ice falls. So that's a little bit different challenge than most people think about, in a desert environment.
I hadn't thought about that. Can you go in the Narrows during the winter?
You can, provided that the water levels are safe and we monitor that. And so, yes, you can, and people do. Often in the winter time, it's advisable to have a dry suit. Kind of depends, what you're going to do.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But the water is very cold. Even right now, we're experiencing snow melt from higher elevations, and the river is running higher than the safe levels. So we don't allow people to hike in the river at this time of year. But even,
I see.
Another few weeks, it's going to be running pretty high.
Yeah, I saw that on the Zion website that the Narrows are currently closed because of the levels. If you go on a backpacking trip in Zion, this is more of a fun, silly question I like to ask superintendents just to get a feel for what people are bringing into the backcountry of their parks. But do you have a favorite snack you like to bring for backpacking?
Oh boy, favorite one, I'm not sure. I usually use some kind of trail mix type of thing.
Yeah.
It's good to have some elements of that are great for quick energy, and others for, longer sustained energy, especially on a long hike. But usually some kind of trail mix.
You're making me think of, I went on a backcountry ski trip last winter, and some of the challenge with that is, sweat management, because you don't want to sweat too much, because then if you stop working out, then you'll get too cold and all that stuff. stuff. And so you're constantly taking on and off layers and all that stuff. And I remember when you stop for a snack, you have to put all your layers on really quick. And so you're like not lollygagging, you're shoving food in your mouth essentially just to get quick energy. And my go-to was chocolate covered almonds because it's kind of similar vibes of a trail mix, maybe a little bit more chocolate in every bite, but which I personally loved, but kind of that like a little bit of protein from the almond and then the like quick energy from the sugar and the chocolate.
Yeah,
So that's
dark
in
chocolate.
case people were curious, that's my favorite.
Yeah, dark chocolate's always great. Also, dried mangoes, that's another favorite.
Ooh, I love dried mangoes. That's a good idea. I'll have to bring that next time. Jumping back kind of in history a little bit, we've talked a little bit about just Zion in general, but digging into your story a little bit, I'm assuming you were interested in the outdoors from a young age because you studied wildlife and fisheries management in college and then got a master's in wildlife biology. So can you share a little bit about kind of what led you to pursue that career path?
Yeah, my siblings and I mean, we were always outdoor kids, and we were fortunate to grow up in an area that had a mix of farm fields and wooded areas and little streams and all those kinds of things in Western New York State. And we were outside all the time. And then, of course, I was involved in scouting for a long time, including working at a Boy Scouts of America camp in the Adirondack Preserve in northern New York.
Oh, wow. That's
so
nice.
Those were great opportunities, and all of our family is very much outdoors oriented. So I think that's kind of how I got into it.
And did you go to school knowing you wanted to pursue that, or is that more kind of what you stumbled into?
No, I intentionally went that direction. Again, I mean, the outdoors and natural resources was something that always intrigued me.
Yeah, and my understanding is that after college, you became a forestry technician for the U.S. Forest Service, and then I believe we're also a wildlife biology intern for BLM. And I actually haven't gotten to talk to a lot of superintendents yet who have worked for the Forest Service or for BLM. So I'm curious what your experience was like in those two. I don't know if agencies is the right term.
Yeah, we're so fortunate in this country to have several land managing agencies, as we kind of refer to them.
Right.
And I was fortunate to get a seasonal forestry technician job with the Forest Service in Black Hills National Forest in the Dakotas and eastern Wyoming. At the time, I was in school, wildlife and fisheries at South Dakota State University. So this was a seasonal job in between semesters. Did that for several years, but that's really where I really became more oriented toward the professional end of managing natural resources. I had a great opportunity to work on things varying from timber sale marking the timber to be sold, to archaeological surveys, old homestead surveys in the Black Hills, some wildlife projects, and also forest firefighting, which was a part of everyone's job there on the forest. And that helped me develop an interest in fire ecology, which I've always been very, very interested in. And yeah, so those were pretty critical jobs in terms of orienting myself professionally.
And what does tree marking entail? What is that process?
Well, it's evaluating size, the age, the other criteria that might be involved in a timber sale. So the Forest Service, as you probably know, does provide a lot of the wood products that we use in the country, and they sell.
I actually didn't know that. That's interesting.
They sell that timber to companies that are going to, make lumber or use those wood products in different ways. And so it depends on the species of tree, the type of timber that the Forest Service is looking to sell, that sort of thing. So we had different evaluation criteria, and we do what's called cruising through a forest stand, and those trees that meet the criteria are marked using a paint gun, basically. And then at the same time, evaluating other trees and plants that need to be kept for wildlife habitat or watershed protection or something like that. So if we had a really steep slope, we wouldn't mark a lot of the timber on a steep slope, because removing it could result in soil erosion issues and those kinds of things. So
interesting.
Yeah, so it's evaluating the timber and really the environment for that whole area.
And I'm assuming that like the archaeological stuff, my reference point, or I guess more of an example that's coming to my mind is when I talked to the Sequoia and Kings Canyon Superintendent Clay. He had mentioned some studies that were done to understand over the last 2,000 years, 3,000 years, how many sequoia trees have died in different forest fires. And he actually set up this really fascinating and also heartbreaking kind of timeline showcasing how intense the wildfires are getting and how many trees are dying compared to forest fires in the 1200s where only 12 trees died and stuff like that. But is it similar? What type of archaeological work were you doing in the forest?
Yeah, I wasn't specifically doing that at that time. I mean, in future years, we became more involved in looking at what we call dendrochronology, which is exactly what Clay was describing. Most of the archaeology work that I did with the Forest Service was a little bit of evaluating indigenous archaeological sites, mostly for protection, but also
Oh, cool.
relocating homesteads from the 1800s and 1900s that had been abandoned or reacquired by the federal government. And just so we knew where those sites were and realizing that they may contain historic artifacts.
I
Of
see.
different types. And so we wanted to protect them, whether we're talking about a timber stand improvement process or perhaps a prescribed fire might be prescribed for a particular area. We wanted to know where those cultural resources were so that we could protect them.
Right. When you were a wildlife biology intern for BLM, was that also during college?
Yeah, that was associated with my master's degree program at New Mexico State.
Oh, I
So
see.
BLM was sponsoring our project. We're evaluating pronghorn antelope habitat on BLM lands in southeast New Mexico. And
Okay.
so I was working on my master's at the same time that I was helping out with BLM.
And do masters have theses?
Yes.
Theses?
Uh-huh.
Did you have a thesis?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was on behavior of pronghorn antelope under different fencing conditions, actually.
Oh, interesting. Like from different farmlands
Yeah.
and private properties, maybe?
Different grazing allotments and those sorts of things on BLM federal land.
So it's interesting to learn because if a park is a national park or if a land is national park, my understanding is that you can't, there's no harvesting of the trees for the timber industry. But then in the US Forest Service, like you said, they're providing a lot of that timber. For BLM land, typically, can it be used for commercial use? I don't know if that's the right term.
Yeah, so some of our land managing agencies do allow what we call multiple use. And again, each of the agencies has kind of their organic legislation from Congress that
Right.
established them as a federal agency, and that sets out what the mission and purposes are. So, in the case of the Forest Service and BLM, they have specific multiple use missions, which include commercial uses. It could be timber harvest, it could be grazing, it could be mining, those sorts of things. The National Park Service generally does not have those kinds of activities. However,
Right.
particular piece of legislation that might establish a park can specify different types of uses. So, I mean, we do have some parks that have some grazing allotments in them, and we have a few parks that have some mining districts included.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it really depends. There could be oil and gas development on some of our national park units. Usually those are in a national preserve as opposed to a national park.
Right.
So it varies. Congress can specify specific uses through the legislation that establishes that unit of the national park system.
But typically, once it's established, they can't really retroactively go back and change the use, right?
No, I mean, that would take, again, action or an act of Congress, as they say, quote unquote.
Oh, I guess, yeah, they could if there was like a change in the legislation. Interesting. After you finished your master's, did you go straight to the Park Service?
No, actually, at the time there were there were very few natural resource jobs around, and I took a job with the U.S. Department of Agricultural
Oh,
animal and
cool.
plant health inspection service, and actually
Okay.
working on the Mexican border where we were inspecting agricultural shipments coming in from Mexico for potential pests or diseases that, we wouldn't want to
Hmm.
have established within the United States. So that was a little bit different tact on what I was kind of looking to do, but also, very informative and a learning experience for sure.
What type of agricultural goods were you evaluating typically?
Oh boy, just all kinds of agricultural commodities ranging from cut flowers
Oh,
to citrus products, all sorts of things that were grown in Mexico that were being imported into the US.
where were you stationed for that?
Laredo, Texas.
Oh, nice. I live in Texas, so I was wondering if it was
Yeah,
Texas.
yeah.
Is Laredo one of the bigger, I don't know if a port is a right way to ask that. Like, is it a bigger port for agriculture?
It is a very important port of entry for agricultural products. Yes, there's a pretty big operation
Huh.
there. We probably had 30 or 40 inspectors.
Wow. Yeah, who knew? I didn't know that. That's cool. What was your journey? I guess, yeah, like you said, it wasn't maybe necessarily what you were expecting, but what was your journey to eventually end up in the Park Service?
Well, I worked for USDA for a year, and then I was offered a position with the National Park Service at Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. And so I went from the Mexican border to the Canadian border. But
Yeah.
that, of course, was a very welcomed opportunity and just a fabulous experience in the Dakotas.
Yeah, I've actually never been to South or North Dakota, so they're on the bucket list for sure. I've heard they're beautiful. One interesting thing is about the Park Service I found is just the way that people move around so much. Like I was talking to the Mammoth Cave superintendent Barkley, and he was talking about how him and his family were up in Denali for a little bit, and then on the Outer Banks group on the most eastern like part of the continental U.S. and just kind of the variety. And like you said, you went from the Mexico border to the Canadian border. So just the diversity in the different places that you're seeing, the communities that you're living in, stuff like that is really interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things about working for the Park Service is the opportunity to see some of these incredible places around the country. And
Right.
we have units out in the Pacific as well and Caribbean, and I've moved somewhat, but not as much as other folks. My average stay is usually about 8 years in a park, but in the course of that too, we do get to travel to other parks to help out projects or an emergency situation or what have you. And so
Right.
it is a great career and real opportunity to see some very special places.
When you've been at Zion, have you had opportunities to travel more recently?
Not as much recently. The work here is pretty busy, and
Yeah.
and at the same time, we have other staff that have particular skills that we want to enhance their skills and give them the opportunities to do some of those projects and help out in other places.
Right.
I've certainly had my opportunity to do that. I want to make sure that
Yeah.
our staff here has those developmental opportunities.
Right. Before you were superintendent at Zion, so I guess, you got bounced around a little bit in the Park Service. I saw you were at Mammoth Cave, which I just interviewed, as I mentioned, Barkley. So thought that was exciting because I learned a ton about Mammoth Cave that I didn't know. But I know you were superintendent at Bryce Canyon, which is also in Utah. So I was curious how being superintendent at Bryce Canyon has been similar to being Zion superintendent, how it's different because they're like geographically close to each other.
Yeah, I'd say the similarities are that, they're both busy parks in terms of visitation and different things that are going
Right.
on there. Certainly, Bryce is a higher elevation park than Zion, so environmentally, it's quite different, but it's still part of the region of the Colorado Plateau, and so
Oh, interesting.
erosion features and other high elevation plant communities and such are very similar, but it's a different environment. I mean, they have real winter up there, we like to say, and whereas we don't see very much here in Zion, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, but definitely a four-season park in terms of the weather and climate type of thing. And
What, Bryce is?
yeah, and
Okay.
the geology is different. Mostly what's What's most visible there or exposed there from erosion is limestone.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
it erodes in a different way than what we see at this elevation in Zion, which is mostly sandstone. So some real differences, but two very busy parks
Yes.
and great experiences to be had.
Jumping into Zion, what are some of the biggest challenges you feel Zion faces as you've been? I mean, you've been superintendent for the past 10 years, so you've probably, I'm curious if you've seen, there seems to be an overarching challenge that always is present with Zion, or if there's things that have popped up more recently.
And I think that the biggest overall challenge is the intensity of visitation,
Yeah,
and that has a lot of cascading effects. It can have
yeah,
effects to natural resources in different situations. Many of our facilities were never built to accommodate that level of visitation. And in fact, many of our facilities are quite old. And
right.
when they get fairly intense pressure, then sometimes these facilities fail. The other thing is that we have natural events that occur in a park like Zion. It's very active geologically, so we have rock falls and landslides and different things
Mm,
like that can close roads or trails or bridges or what
mm,
have you. And so when you have really intense visitation, then we kind of have to look, okay, well, how do we accommodate these visitors differently?
right.
And just the backlog of deferred maintenance in many of our parks, but certainly Zion sees it. This intense use kind of exacerbates that backlog of
Yeah,
maintenance, or vice versa, I guess might be a better way to say it. But
yeah,
we're always challenged to keep those facilities in good condition. But we're also looking at our environment and what's the experience that we want visitors to have. So we're
right.
particularly protective of our night skies, our soundscape, our wildlife
What's a
habitat.
soundscape?
Soundscape, yeah. We often think about the sights in a park, but have we thought about the sound and those natural sounds that we want people to experience?
Mm,
And, can we hear the canyon wren, little tiny bird that makes a lot of sound? But often in a crowded environment, that sound may not be evident to people. And so we want people
I see.
to hear, the rustling of the cottonwood leaves and hear the birds and see, not only see those things, but hear those things as well. So those are some of the things that when we have really crowded situations that can often be lost. And so when we have
Yeah.
some of our youth groups out, and myself, when I'm on the trail, I always try to ask visitors, what can you hear? Because in a park
Mm,
like Zion, you see this incredible landscape. So the visual resource is there and it's very evident, but sometimes we lose the natural sound environment, which is
mm.
really important to the experience.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that before. I mean, I think it's a great way to be grounded by listening, just, taking a minute and listening to the sounds around you, even if you're in a bustly street in New York City. Because I think we kind of zone things out as a way we would get overwhelmed if we were always listening to everything. But
Yeah, and the soundscape isn't just something for us. It's important in terms of the natural environment as well, because animals need to
mm,
communicate. And
yeah.
we
Oh,
need,
I haven't thought about that.
yeah, we need to think about that. I mean, it could be a situation of species communicating about a predator nearby. It could be locating your mate. All those types of auditory signals that are in the natural environment are important to
Yeah.
wildlife.
How do you manage, or how are you trying to continuously manage the high visitation? I know that I think it was maybe last year you introduced a permit to Angel's Landing.
Yeah, and we're still piloting that permit system. I can say that
Okay.
it's been very successful in terms of improving the visitors' experience and reducing the
Right.
crowding, which was a big concern. And again, we want
It's a
people.
safety concern too,
It
right?
is, and we we have many, many, many people that want to experience that. And it is truly a fantastic hike. But we also need to understand that, the experience can be diminished when, again, there's the potential for overcrowding. So basically, we've been able to
Right.
kind of, with the lottery permit system, is kind of spread that visitation out so that it's not occurring really intensely at certain periods of the day, but to kind of spread that out.
Right. And then I also actually saw that the Ironman World Championship was brought to the Zion area as kind of a way to encourage folks and teach folks of ways to recreate in the Zion area, but not maybe outside of the actual park boundaries, just to distribute some of the usage. Has that been a helpful avenue, you feel?
Well, we've been working with our state office of tourism and our local county tourism offices to really help push their initiative for visitors to the state and the area to be good stewards and
Right.
to practice those things like leave no trace and others to take good care of the environment wherever they might be, whether it's in the national park or BLM public lands by, or on Forest Service lands nearby, or state lands. And also,
Right.
at the same time to remember that there are private lands in the area, and to make sure that they have permission and that they take good care of and act appropriately whenever they're out and about, whether they're on federal, state, or private lands.
When I was interviewing Chip Jenkins of Grand Teton, he said Grand Teton's biggest challenge, and arguably like one of the Park Service's biggest challenges, how to teach people to be stewards, and how acknowledging that we aren't born knowing how to do that, like it has to be taught to leave no trace. And it starts with just understanding the value in the area. And typically when someone values an area, they're more likely to want to take care of it. But like showing and communicating that value, and then in addition to that, teaching the ways to recreate and responsibly and not leave trash, stuff like that. That maybe if you've spent a lot of time in the parks, or like on recreating outside, you're like, oh, duh, that seems obvious, but it actually isn't necessarily. And so,
Yeah, I think that's really important. And all of those activities where we're teaching folks how to recreate, so to speak, that's a responsibility for all of us. And,
yeah,
across our agencies, our Utah Office of Outdoor Recreation does a great job with that. I mentioned the Utah Office of Tourism and our local tourism offices earlier, and they really promote that. And in our schools, we have an opportunity to be in the classroom, our education rangers, and then bring school children to the park and help them not only understand and value those areas, but as you say, once they gain that understanding and value, then they tend to take good care of things. And we have a very active junior ranger program that thousands of kids and families participate in over the course of the year. And sometimes it's interesting when we overhear the youngsters remind their parents, hey, you shouldn't be doing this.
Oh, that's so cute. That's like the best. Because, yeah, I just love.
Or don't forget to recycle that thing, Dad.
Yeah. Yeah, or like, hey, we should be composting or something. I don't know. That's really cute. I know we're nearing our time, but I have two more quick questions. The first being, are you working with do you have a national park like friends group that you're working with to help with some of the deferred maintenance backlogs, or how are you addressing some of the deferred maintenance you mentioned?
Yeah, and I really want to talk for just a minute about our Zion National Park Forever project. They are a nonprofit cooperating association here that serves Zion National Park, Cedar Breaks National Monument, Pipe Spring National Monument, and assists the Dixie National Forest as well. And
Cool.
having this local nonprofit friends group that works with us hand in hand, day in, day out. They help run our visitor centers. They are involved in grant seeking and philanthropic operations to help us with all sorts of things, from bighorn sheep satellite tracking to fixing a bridge, trail project, what have you. They're just very dedicated and fantastic group of people. Their staff, their board of directors are just wonderful.
Yeah, that's cool. I've continued to learn that the parks could not run without their friends groups, and just hearing the crucial roles they play has been really cool. So shout out to them.
Absolutely. We couldn't do it without them, to be honest.
Yeah. My way that I like to close out the interviews is by asking, what is something you wish everyone knew about Zion National Park, regardless if they have or haven't been?
Yeah, one of the things I think would be to remind people that these national parks and all of our public lands are part of traditional homelands of indigenous people. And these folks, these tribal groups and entities are here. They're with us. And not to forget that we live in the present and respect the past, working with our tribal communities.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to be reminded of that. So thank you for highlighting that. And thank you for your time, Jeff. It's been really fun getting to know a little bit more about you and your experience in your past leading up to being Zion superintendent. And then I learned a ton of, I haven't been to Zion yet. And so I see it through the lens of, candidly, Angels Landing and the Narrows. And it's cool to learn about some of the different experiences folks can have within the park.
Yeah, my pleasure. And you'll have to come visit.
Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.